So it's important that the Hebrew text is actually between the transliteration and the translation, so that one's eye can go back and forth between each of those three columns. Just notice that doing it this way, I'm able to lay out all the Hebrew as poetry rather than as prose. Old prayer books had everything as prose. Sentences run on to conserve space so that fewer pages were used. But here I'm able to make the entire prayer book actually in the form of poetry. All of the Psalms, of course, were written as poetry, but many of the other prayers were written as poetry as well. So I'm also able to write the translations as poetry also. It may not always sound that way because you need more English words to express something than you do in Hebrew. But the intention was that the English should be used as poetry, so it will be read as poetry, and so that if someone wants to daven in English as well as in Hebrew or go back and forth, it should be possible to do that. And in fact, in my minyan, I do, when I lead the service, I do go back and forth davening in English and Hebrew as the leader. Notice also that at the bottom of this page, you can't read the text, but it says a guide to the spiritual journey of the morning prayers. And in fact, comments like this appear at the bottom of many pages because they are sort of milestones, so to speak, in the course of the service. And it starts out by saying on the bottom on the right that the spiritual aim of the morning prayers is to bring us to the realization that God, however we understand God, can make a difference in our lives. And that really is a fundamental notion of the Siddur. Okay, so let me say I don't need to share this anymore for right now. I'll come back to it later. Okay, why did I write this Siddur? For many years, I've been giving courses relating to prayer, and I always asked my students what made it difficult for them to pray. What were their obstacles to prayer? And in preparing Siddur Ratzon, I tried to address those obstacles to help people overcome those obstacles. One feature of Siddur Ratzon, as you saw, as you know, is that it includes a complete transliteration of the Hebrew. Because one obstacle that many of our fellow Jews have to participating in prayer is simply that they don't read Hebrew. And that will be true of any synagogue, even Orthodox synagogues. I'm sure that's true of many people. So not being able to read Hebrew, because of that, they can't participate in reciting the communal prayers, in singing together with other congregants. By withholding a transliteration from them, we are punishing their inability to read Hebrew by preventing them from participating in the communal prayers. That doesn't make sense. So this transliteration for me was a very important part of this. I was very disappointed when the conservative movement came out with Lev Shalem because they did not have a complete transliteration. I had encouraged the editor to include one, but they didn't. Ironically, it turns out that many people use the transliteration to help improve their reading of the Hebrew, because they go back and forth from the transliteration to the Hebrew, and so over time they learn to read the Hebrew. Not everybody, but many. Another obvious decision was that Siddur Ratzon should have a column of commentary. Most people who enter a synagogue have no idea what's happening. Regulars, of course, do, but the others don't. Knowing the page number is helpful, but that's the only information they get. That doesn't help them understand what's going on in the service. When I was a teenager, I was a vendor at the stadium of the Rochester Red Wings, a few miles down the thruway. They're not there anymore, I don't think. Whatever there is something different, but I was there. And so I would stand just inside the gates and yell, "You can't tell the players without a scorecard." Well, it turns out that you also can't tell the prayers without a scorecard. And so that's the function of this commentary column, to give people an idea of what's happening on this page. The third of the most commonly mentioned obstacles was the ubiquitous references to God as male. It turns out that this was very easy to address in the translation. All references to God in Siddur Ratzon in English are in the second person. God is spoken of as you rather than as he. Since you in English is gender neutral, that solves the problem. But is that a legitimate solution from a traditional perspective? What I found was that in the Psalms, God is referred to frequently in the second person, and indeed references to God in the Psalms seamlessly switch back and forth between second and third person. So I don't want to give you the details, but the next time you look at the prayer Ashrei, Psalm 145, which is in the morning service and also in the afternoon service, Ashrei, you can count the number of times that the language switches between referring to God in the second person and referring to God in the third person, and you'll be quite amazed. One consequence of using you instead of he in referring to God turns out to be that the distance between us and God is decreased, so that our prayers can become more personal. A number of people have pointed this out to me. I'm told that when the King James Version of the Bible was written, the word thou was a more personal pronoun than you, because they had the same idea in mind. They wanted people to be able to connect to God personally. In the subsequent centuries, the two words thou and you switched meanings, so that now thou is the formal version and you is the informal version, and people are using the wrong word from the King James, from the perspective of the authors of the King James Version. Since we're talking about gender, it should also be noted that the traditional Siddur uses phrases like our God and God of our fathers, Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu, and that also can be an obstacle for many people. So in Siddur Ratzon, I changed that phrase to Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu, our fathers and mothers. So I added our mothers there, and also in the list of ancestors in the Amida, where we speak of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I also add Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. It should be Leah and Rachel, but I did it wrong. So anyways, those changes were made wherever they were appropriate. A fourth obstacle that people had was philosophical. There are a number of key concepts that are deal breakers for many people. The solution for that in Siddur Ratzon was to give people permission in the translation and in the commentaries to have different views, to acknowledge, for example, that not all Jews believe in the traditional views of life after death, or the chosenness of the Jewish people, or the restoration of the temple. And just because you don't subscribe to the traditional beliefs, you don't have to abandon prayer and abandon Judaism. So that also meant providing alternative language for problematic prayers. Other Siddurim had done this before, so I was certainly not the first to do this. Another important deal breaker for many people, about which others are unaware, is that when the Tana Tokef prayer on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur suggests, by suggesting that your fate in life as a consequence of your actions, is theologically Calvinistic, not Jewish, and psychologically a blame the victim approach to human suffering. I've had several people come to me when I've spoken in synagogues and say, I'm glad you modified the treatment of Natana Tokef because my son died, and there was no good reason theologically for his death. He just died. And why should he be blamed as a Matana Tokov appears to do to many people for them. So the whole issue of philosophical objections had to be dealt with, and I felt I did. A fifth obstacle was language. So that is the translation of any passages in existing Siddurim did not shed light on the meaning of the Hebrew. Now, there are many people who like to pray in Hebrew, which they don't understand, so that they can avoid grappling with what the prayers mean. But there are also many who want to know and understand what they're saying. So Psalm 23 is a good example of this. It starts out, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," in the King James Version. What does that phrase mean? Well, we can figure that out. Many of us can figure that out because occasionally we use the word want to mean lack. That's not the way it's usually used, but it sometimes can be used that way. But many people are not aware of that. So when it says, "I shall not want," what does that mean? I don't want God to be my shepherd? It's certainly backwards of what it should be. And what about the line, "for his name's sake"? What does that mean? That is very hard to figure out what that means. So here's how I express the opening lines of Psalm 23, a song of David. "With you as my shepherd, Adonai, I have everything I need. You provide me food from lush pastures. You lead me to drink from peaceful waters. You restore my soul when I am in distress. You provide me guidance and direction, because that's what a shepherd does." The translators of the King James Version did not understand that the word shame in ancient Hebrew didn't just mean one's name, but also referred to one's essence. So that the words Lama'an Shemo in Psalm 23 doesn't mean "for his name's sake," but for that is God's essence. God is a shepherd. That's how we understand it. It's one way of understanding God as a shepherd. So, because that's what a shepherd does, reflects that much better than the phrase "for his name's sake." I know that some of those present have questions about my translations of Psalm 23, and I hope that you will ask further questions because I have much more to say about it. A sixth obstacle is that translations of the prayers are too literal, and so don't convey in English the messages that appear in the Hebrew. So when translating the Siddur, I had to figure out the meaning, the intention of every part of every prayer. And very often what I found was that in order to convey the meaning of the prayer, I had to translate it not literally, not word for word, okay? So sometimes I would translate phrases, sometimes sentences, and sometimes even paragraphs so as to convey their meaning rather than focus on the individual words. If a translation diverges substantially from the literal translation, then I point that out in the side column and often give the literal translation. I also try to maintain the flow of the Hebrew in the translations most of the time, so that the prayers become, as I said before, as davenable in English as they are in Hebrew. The seventh obstacle, and the last obstacle I will discuss, is repetition. Following the Shema in the morning service, let me show you that page. In fact, I showed that page before. 1 second. Let's share my screen again. Is that this page? Yes. Okay, this is the page I shared before. Following the Shema, if you can see, you don't need to read the words, but you can follow the cursor here. There are 16 adjectives. Emet, v'yatziv, v'nachon, v'kayam, 4 in the first line, then 4 in the next line, 4 in the next, 4 in the next. 16 adjectives in a row. That's not how we talk. That's not how we read. Emet, v'yatziv, v'yachom, v'kayam, and so on. That's not how we talk today, and such lists don't resonate with those who are in the service nowadays. Simply put, people find such repetition boring. What I tried to do was not make it boring. So we'll come back to this in just a minute. And this provides a segue to the second part of my presentation. We often think of the prayer book as simply a list of prayers that we recite by rote. 1 second. Yes, so let me stop the screen sharing for a moment. Stop screen sharing. Okay. So we often think of a prayer book as simply a list of prayers that we recite by rote. What I learned from writing a Siddur is that our prayer book is a compendium of spiritual guidance. Compendium of spiritual guidance. If you're looking for spirituality and meaning in Judaism, the Siddur is where you will find it. 30 years ago, long before I imagined writing a Siddur, let alone a Machzor, I was involved in creating and leading guided meditations on various psalms and prayers. What I learned from this activity was that the authors of these psalms and prayers were people who had experienced great spiritual insights and who tried to convey those insights in the words that they wrote. It is not easy to translate spiritual insights into words. And even when you do, the words that you use are always inadequate. Fast forward thousands of years, we look at those inadequate words and we try to translate them from one language from another, from one millennium to another, from one culture to another. It's no wonder that the insight is often lost, and that as a result, it is sometimes hard to recite those prayers and find them meaningful. In leading those guided meditations, I took it as my task to try to, quote, recapture the wow experience, unquote, of our ancestors. Here's a simple example. At the beginning of the morning service, speaking of the soul that God gave me, that God gave each of us, the text says 7 words. Ata brata, ata yitzarta, ata nefachta bi. You created it, you fashioned it, and you breathed it into me. The words used by the author echoes the language in the initial chapters of Genesis, and so we can understand his insight. He is telling us that he imagines the life force entering each one of us as a reenactment of the life force that God provided the very first human beings. He imagines that just as God breathed the very first soul breath into our ancestors in the garden, so God breathed our very first soul breath into each of us. And so God breathes the breath of life, the breath of soul, into us at each and every moment. Every breath that we take is an interaction between ourselves and the divine. Every breath that we take is an interaction between ourselves and the divine. Now, whether you understand this literally or metaphorically, the words tell us that we can view the routine act of breathing as having cosmic significance. That thousands of times each day, God is breathing into us the breath of life. Wow, that's amazing. I don't use that word too often in the Siddur, but I do use it directly after the Shema, at the beginning of the list of 14 adjectives. What could be more boring than a list of 14 adjectives? Yet, that is what the author uses to convey the wow that he felt when he had the insight that Adonai, the God of our ancestors, is our God as well. Let me go back and put this back up again. I'm sorry that I'm jumping around like this, but okay, here we are. Share. And now let me try to make it larger. How did I make it larger? I did this, okay. Zoom, Zoom a couple times. Okay, so I want this to go away. How do I make it go away? I don't know. There it is. Okay, but you're all here, so I'm going to move you over to the other side of my screen. Okay, there we are. So here's how it goes. Adonai Elohechem Emet. Adonai is your God, and that is true. And here's how I translate this passage. Wow, this teaching is so amazing, I cannot find enough words to describe it. Tell it like it is. It is definitely true, Emet, and always will be. It provides reliable direction to my life. I love it. It is dear and precious and pleasant to me. It is awesome and powerful. It is sweet and beautiful. It is true. You are the eternal ruler, and you are our God. You are the rock of Jacob, and you are the shield that saves us. Generations come and generations go, but you endure, and your redemptive power does not diminish. Earthly rulers come and go, but your reign is everlasting. Theories come and go, but your words are living and enduring, trustworthy and appealing forever, and through eternity of eternities. For our ancestors and for us, for our children and for their children, for generations reaching into the future, this teaching will remain firmly with us forever, a truth, a faith that will not pass away. Wow. Again, whether you understand this literally or metaphorically, the idea that God can make a difference in our lives is a powerful one. Let me close this now. Okay. In my translations and comments in the Siddur and the Machzor, I've tried to convey what I have learned from the authors of the prayers and from the editors of the prayer book. If you are seeking to enhance your prayer experience or to enrich your spiritual life, and you find that my observations resonate with you, I encourage you to get a hold of a copy of the Siddur and by yourself or with other friends, read and study the prayers, comments, kavanot, meditations. Trying to do this while you're participating in the service itself is difficult because the service moves at a pretty fast pace. But you can decipher prayers one at a time with the aid of the comments and kavanot meditations, and then treat the prayers which you have learned and internalized as stepping stones as you move through the regular service. So that's how I visualize it. I move from this prayer to this prayer to this prayer to this prayer and to the end of the service. Because for me, I've gone through many of the prayers, and so have what I feel is a good understanding of what the author tried to convey. So as I said before, I was amazed again and again at the spiritual messages that I discovered in prayers that I have recited by rote thousands of times over the years without really understanding them. And I discovered, or rather rediscovered, the spiritual journey that the editors of the Siddur embedded in the morning Shabbat service, Shacharit service, and that I describe in detail in the Siddur. I'd like to focus for a few minutes on Sim Shalom, which is the final blessing in the bracha, blessing in the morning Amidah, on weekdays and on Shabbat and on festivals. The Sim Shalom prayer is a midrash on the familiar priestly blessing. That is, it takes an image that appears in the priestly blessing and expands on it in a very creative way. Perhaps we're unaware of this connection, even though Sim Shalom comes immediately after the priestly blessing in the repetition of the morning Amidah. So the priestly blessing you all recognize, but I'll read it to you. Yivarechacha Adonai v'yishmerecha. May God bless you and watch over you. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chudeka. May God's face shine on you with grace. Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. May God's face be directed to you, granting you peace. You notice the repetition and prominence of the phrase God's face. Panav. which is often translated as countenance, a word that none of us uses or understands. The author of the Sim Shalom prayer takes the idea that God's face will shine on you, Ya'er Adonai Panav Elecha, and elaborates it into a multitude of blessings, including the gift of Shalom, that are constantly streaming to us from Or Panecha, light of your face. We can easily visualize and understand this metaphor, since light and heat are constantly streaming to us from one of God's creations, the sun. So the notion of blessings streaming to us is not remote. It's something that we see every day. So what I'm going to ask you to do is close your eyes and listen to this meditation. Take a deep breath. Imagine looking at the sun, which of course you can only do with your eyes closed, and then looking beyond the sun and seeing beyond the sun a source of energy more powerful and more pervasive than the sun itself. The source of energy we imagine as the life of the universe, Chei HaOlamim, the source of energy that we call God. Imagine God streaming blessing to us, to all the world, all the time. Focus on each of these blessings for a moment, picturing each of them as streaming to us, as streaming to you from the life of the universe. Picture the blessing of life, each day, the gift of a new day, streaming to us from the life of the universe. Picture the blessing of strength, strength that enables us to carry out each of our many tasks and responsibilities. Strength streaming to us from the life of the universe. Picture the blessing of courage, courage to do the tasks that are difficult for us to do. Courage to live each day despite the many annoyances and obstacles we encounter. Courage streaming to us from the life of the universe. Picture the blessing of faith, faith that we are not alone, that we will survive and thrive. Faith that each one of us is significant in God's world. Faith streaming to us from the life of the universe. Picture the blessing of love, unconditional love, unbounded love. Love of God for each of us. Love streaming to us at each moment from the life of the universe. Picture the blessing of compassion, the ability to feel the pain and recognize the needs of our fellow human beings. Compassion streaming to us from the life of the universe. Picture the blessing of forgiveness, enabling us to forgive others, enabling us to forgive ourselves. Forgiveness streaming to us from the life of the universe. And picture the blessing of shalom, inner peace, of wholeness, of serenity, of harmony. Shalom streaming to us from the life of the universe. These and many other blessings are God's daily bounty. Take a deep breath and acknowledge how many blessings come to us each day, each moment, from the source of all blessings, Chei HaOlamim, from the life of the universe. Wow, God's blessings are streaming to us all the time. Yet again, whether you understand this literally or metaphorically, this is a powerful idea. God's blessings are streaming to us all the time. One of the purposes of prayer is to help us become receptive to these blessings. We have to become aware of them. We have to ask for them. Many things in life are free, but they don't just show up on our doorstep. We only get them when we take an appropriate action. We can only smell the flowers when we stop to smell the flowers. We can tune into God's blessings and receive them loud and clear, or we can remain on a different frequency and be oblivious to their existence. We can choose to remain in darkness, unaware of God's light, or we can choose to turn away from darkness and bask in the light of God's face, of God's presence. We lead complicated lives, and it's sometimes difficult to recognize those blessings that are streaming toward us. One of the verses in Psalm 92, the Psalm for Shabbat, reads, "Lahagid baboker chasdecha ve'emunatcha baleilot," to proclaim your loving kindness in the morning and your faithfulness at night. Why does the Psalm specifically mention proclaiming God's chesed, God's loving kindness in the morning, and God's emunah, God's faithfulness at night? I remember walking to services one Shabbat morning in the spring some years ago, chanting this verse, and suddenly realizing what it meant. Here's how I tried to convey the insight of the psalmist in Siddur Ratzon. During daytime, when we can look up and see light, it is easy to recognize God's presence and God's blessings. When, however, the light disappears, we can only remind ourselves that God's presence is still with us, that God's blessings are still available to us, even though the evidence for God's presence has gone. In the morning, your loving kindness, your chesed is apparent. But at night, we can only rely on your emunah, your faithfulness. Day and night are understood here both literally and figuratively. If we store up our evidence of God's presence at life's brighter moments, we can use it to remind ourselves of God's continuing presence when we find ourselves in the dark. Each of us has moments in our lives when we are in a dark place, when we feel alone, when we wonder where our life is going, when daily living seems to be burdensome, and perhaps when the situation appears hopeless. The psalmist tells us that we need to prepare ourselves for these dark moments. If we acknowledge God's presence when all is going well, that will enable us to deal with the moments that are difficult. But we will then be able to recognize that even though God's presence appears to have been obscured by clouds, even though God's blessings are no longer evident, they are still streaming to us. We can bank our positive feelings and redeem them in negative times. There's much more that I can say, but now is the time for me to conclude my initial remarks. One summary of my remarks is the meditation that I usually read at the end of the Amidah, and I will try to recite that as part of my answer to one of your questions. So let me close with a bracha, a blessing. May each of us come to recognize and acknowledge all the blessings that we receive. May each of us come to feel God's presence in our lives, to feel God's blessings streaming toward us at every moment. May each of us find deeper meaning in the poetry of our ancestors. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very, very much. Wonderful, wonderful. And we had a meditation there too, so it was really a plus. Let me open it for questions. If anyone has a question, please use the function at the bottom. There's a smiley face reactions. If you hit that, you'll see raise hand, so then you could raise a hand and ask a question. If not, I have some pre-written questions from some of you. We could start off there. This is a lot to think about because I personally, here I'm going to put my 2 cents in, which is prayer, just like the study of Torah, has many levels, as we know. And one of the advantages that your Siddur gives is that what we don't do very often in a service, as you say, it goes by quickly because it's sort of meant to do that, because lots of prayer is also mantra. It's supposed to sort of be the process of just doing it quickly and in its sort of musical mean. But what we don't usually do is take the time and try to figure out what it says. Even if we understand the Hebrew, we often don't figure out the significance. So just like listening to the Torah reading on a Shabbat morning, you could just listen to it, but that's quite different than sitting down and learning what it means. So that takes a lot more effort and time. So those are two different levels right there. And then there's even a third level, which is, again, I have to do an advertisement for the cantors out there. The notion of cantorial music is supposed to incorporate the higher meaning of the prayer by the music that's endowed to it. And in that is also, part of that is the breathing. Because, if it's done in the right way, in a sort of, let's put it this way, in a traditional way, it gives meaning to where you linger, and it gives meaning to where you go fast or combine this to that. And so there's different paces, different breathings, and so on. So so many levels to address it. And I think this is one of the great things about this in general, about not only is it very available to people, but even the commentary on the sides. I know many people have come to services and have read this little pieces on the side, and they go, "Oh my God, I didn't know that's why I was doing that." But that's exactly what you want them to be able to do.
Yes.
Yeah, and with that background and with the familiarity that comes with time, helped by transliteration, they then can build on the significance as they go along. So it takes also familiarity. You can't do it in the first try.
Yes, what you say is quite correct. That you can't jump from not being able to read the prayers to full participation. That it takes time. It takes study, as you point out, but nevertheless, it's something that we generally don't do. We will have discussions of the Torah readings, and we will have discussions like other things about, like Pirkei Avot, which I'm not talking about tonight. But we very rarely sit down and discuss what does this particular prayer mean, and that's something that would advantage everybody, because some people have things to say about how they experience that prayer, which may be very meaningful for other people.
So, any questions from out there? And then, if not, I'll start to ask some of the questions that were pre-sent in. It's a quiet. I always say to my students, quiet students are not good students.
It says in Pirkei Avot, "Ein habayishan lomed." Someone who is embarrassed to ask questions will never learn. Right. That's something that I learned as a kid. I learned that in Pirkei Avot, and so I've always spoken up because that's the way you learn, is you ask questions.
Right. Exactly. Marty and Shelley, go ahead.
I have a question. I've been asked this. Why is it important to read the words of the prayers in Hebrew? I mean, why do you feel that it's important to do that? I know you said that that with your services sometimes you daven in English. What would you say is the answer to that?
So it's important because it connects us through the generations. And that's a very important thing. That when I say the prayers in Hebrew, I know that they're the same prayers, sort of, that my grandparents, great-grandparents said, going back many, many generations. And that's a very important fact. But in fact, many people don't read Hebrew, and this is not something new. The Septuagint translation of the Torah into Greek, which was done almost 2,500 years ago, was done because people didn't know the Hebrew. And in rabbinic times, they asked the same question: can we say the prayers in other languages? And someone said, well, you can say it in other languages only if it's in Greek, but other languages you couldn't use. So they had all sorts of debates about this because Jews, many Jews, maybe even the majority of Jews, didn't know the prayers in Hebrew. And I'm sure that, not all of my great grandparents knew the prayers as well as they might. But it does resonate in Hebrew in a way which is different than otherwise. But it's still important, I feel, that one be able to say the words, say the words which have the same meaning in Hebrew, in English, because it's important for us to focus on the words. That if we say it only in Hebrew, we often say it, and we say it quickly as we do during services. One reason why our services have to be quick is because they're long. I mean, Muslims have a much shorter prayer service. And when they come to a Jewish prayer service, they're always amazed how these people can stay there for so long. We have a very long prayer service. We have to go through it quickly. And when you go through it quickly, it's very easy to become distracted from the meaning. And so I use English because I want to bring back the meaning into the service. But still, I feel it's important to do the Hebrew as well.
I agree.
It also, I mean, the side benefit, it also connects us geographically with, other countries, people in other communities that praying in Hebrew. We can go to a synagogue in Algiers, whatever, and so.
Absolutely. Even though the Hebrew may be pronounced differently, it still is recognizable. Yes. So, yes. And so that links us together. I mean, we are a people, and that's one very important part of Judaism. Not only are we a religion, we are a people. And what ties us together is that we are, traditionally at least, saying prayers in Hebrew. And in the last 50 years, there's been much more Hebrew for example, in the Reform movement, which left it for quite some time.
I would also go to bat for Hebrew for another reason. It's actually a beautiful language, and the people who wrote a lot of the piyutim, not just the regular prayers, which often incorporate lines from the Torah and so on, but the ones that are especially high holidays where you have these piyutim written in medieval times, absolutely beautiful Hebrew, and often there's a musicality to them that they often conserve words but give tremendous meaning. I pulled out, you'll know there's a Yala Tachnunenu, which you on Yom Kippur Eve, and each line, it's 3-line stanzas. It's beautiful, beautiful, beautiful Hebrew. And you're absolutely right. For every word in Hebrew, you have to come up, this is page 53 if you want in your Machzor. For every Hebrew word, you have to throw in 3 or so English words. But the Hebrew is it's an example of beautifully written Hebrew, which has a what's the word? Onomatopoeia. I don't know what else to say. It has a music to it just by reading it.
Yes, and it certainly can't be duplicated in English because Hebrew has because of all of the prefixes, suffixes, and tenses, can say things much more tersely with fewer words, and make a much stronger impression because it is so so intense. Let's say.
Right. It also again allows for the mantra part of prayer to get in there. And Hebrew does that very, very well. Again, this is like, you'll hear this all the time. Operas in English are horrible. English is not a great language for opera. Italian, maybe French, right? But and I totally agree with that because of the way English comes across. It really just doesn't, whereas Italian has that sort of legato, and so I think, Hebrew there's some beautiful, it's absolutely beautiful stuff that, when you get to know it. All right. Any other we're just getting warmed up with the prayers, with the questions here. Any other questions? Because let me throw in one of the questions that was asked. Actually, this is, I'm adapting one from John Hampel, who's online. So he said, he asked, did the experience of producing the Siddur appreciably change your own prayer practice in any way that you would be comfortable sharing with us? If your practice changed, are you able to state whether this happened during or after your work on the Siddur?
So that's a very, very good question. In fact, in some ways, I learned to daven by writing a Siddur because many of the prayers I really, as I said before, many of the prayers I had said literally thousands of times. I'm old enough to say thousands of times I've said these prayers and never stopped to think what they meant. Because like everybody else, I'm saying the prayers quickly as part of a service, and I don't study them outside of the service. But here I had to study each prayer. So of course it changed my davening tremendously. The meditations that I had done earlier had done the same thing. I published a meditation, a tape. It was actually a tape in the mid-90s, consisting of two 30-minute guided meditations, one on Psalm 23 and one on Psalm 27. And so that changed my prayer immensely because I understood Psalm 23. I understood Psalm 27. And I understood each of the other prayers that I did meditations on, like Psalm 92, the prayer for Shabbat, and various other ones. I looked at how, and so I'd already come to the idea that if I spent time with each prayer, I could understand what that prayer means, and it can be meaningful to me. I don't have to go through the whole meditation, but I remember the point of the meditation on that prayer. I remember what the point of that prayer was. I remember what the point of 23 is, I remember, and so on. So I learned that from doing the meditations. And then when I wrote the Siddur, I wanted to come with the same consciousness to all of the prayers. That was difficult, and things change. So let me, this is a good point for me to interject what I said I would interject. I want to read the prayer which I wrote, a meditation which I wrote for the end of the Amidah. So the Amidah, as you all know, is the central prayer of each prayer service. It's not central in the middle, it's the climax of each prayer service. And it's choreographed as an audience with God. We step forward into the Amidah, we step back out of the Amidah, we bow at certain times as if we are having a personal encounter with God. And it occurred to me that at the end of the Amidah, you have this interview with God, and then you just sort of walk away. And that just didn't seem right to me. It seemed that what I needed to do as I left the Amidah was to tell myself how I can stay in God's presence even though I'm leaving the Amidah. So I wrote this prayer, and I'm going to show it to you here, and I'm going to read it to you. And you can read along, or you can close your eyes. You may not be able to read it. Is it here? Let's see. No, it shouldn't be there. Where is it? One second. That's not it. Okay, I'm going to have to read it to you and not have it on the screen. I don't want to spend the time looking for it. I thought I had it there, but I don't. Okay. Let's see. Various places here, but let me just find it. Let me takes us from the Siddur. So this is at the end of each Amidah. I have the following prayer. And again, the purpose of the prayer is to tell us how we keep ourselves in God's presence even after we finish the Amidah. So I say this every time I say the Amidah, I recite this prayer. Not everybody in my community does that, but that's their choice. So here's how it goes. Elohai, my God, as I leave your presence, I remind myself that it is I, not you, who is leaving. For you are always present in my life. When I take a deep breath, I can find you again. For you are only a breath away. When I picture your light and turn toward it, my darkness is dispelled. For in your light, I see light. When my soul utters a prayer, I know that you hear me, for you are always receptive to prayer. Elohai, my God, help me recognize and acknowledge all the blessings that you provide. For when I express my gratitude, I'm reminded of your presence. Help me remember that you created everything, that the world does not revolve around me. For when I express my humility, I'm reminded of your presence. Help me ask you for guidance and assistance, and affirm that you make a difference in my life. For when I express my dependence, I'm reminded of your presence. Shiviti Adonai lenegdi tamid. Help me keep your presence directly in my field of vision at each and every moment. V'shavti b'veit Adonai le'orech yamim. Help me choose each day to live in your house, to feel your presence all the days of my life. Yehu Ratzon imrei fi, v'hagyon libi lefanecha, Adonai tzuri v'goali. You are my rock, source of my strength. You are my redeemer, source of my hope. And you accept with love and joy the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart. And that is so. Amen. So that's, for me, that really sums up much of the spiritual meaning of the Siddur, that God's presence is always with us, that whenever we feel gratitude, whenever we feel humility, whenever we feel that God is available to us, we are reminded of God's presence. And that can be at any time. That any breath can be a breath from the divine, cosmic breath, as we said. And again, I have to say this each time I talk in these terms. You may understand this literally. You may understand this metaphorically. That's either way is perfectly fine, because even if you understand it metaphorically, it makes a difference in your life. So yes, so my prayer changed. Another way in which my prayer changed, aside from just general thing, is that in the tradition, every Amidah is a petitionary prayer in part. That is to say, we have an audience with God, and we tell God what's on our mind. In the tradition, petitionary prayers are not said on Shabbat. I'm not sure exactly what the reason is, whether we're giving God a rest or we're giving ourselves a rest. I don't know, but that's the tradition, that petitionary prayers are not said on Shabbat. However, most of us, unless we're Orthodox, probably don't say the Amidah every day and only say the Amidah on Shabbat. So we don't get to say petitionary prayers. So I felt it was very important to create a petitionary prayer which was appropriate for Shabbat, which was in some ways like the traditional petitionary prayers which are said during the week, but which is different, which is for Shabbat. And so I wrote a petitionary prayer in Hebrew and in English, which appears in the Siddur. Again, most people who use the Siddur pass over it because they're not used to it. But it is something that I encourage you to look at the next time you're at a Shabbat morning service, or if you have available a copy of the Siddur to you, to look at it and to think about it. Now, in a way, it's very odd for me to say that I wrote a petitionary prayer, because if you've read the introduction to my Siddur, you'll know that I don't believe that God micromanages the universe. That God doesn't decide which team will win the game. God doesn't decide who's going to win the lottery. God doesn't even decide who's going to get a parking space or be searching forever for one. But nevertheless, I feel that petitionary prayers in the form which I introduced it into the Siddur is something which does not violate that principle and is petitionary in the sense of you're talking to God about where you are as a person today, what your needs are, what your aspirations are, what your hopes are, what your problems are. And that's important for us to do, which I never thought that I would do that on a Shabbat, because I grew up with the idea that Shabbat, you don't say petitionary prayers, but I felt. So that's another way in which my own prayers have become different. There probably are many others, but I should stop answering this question, John, and go on.
Yes, and thank you very, very much. That was a beautiful and generous response, and thank you, Erwin, for bringing it forward.
I have more questions, though. It's not over. There's more of your questions, and I'm trying to mix and match from different authors here, so we'll get more of your questions. I have one from Marty. This is, again, it could start as more of a brass tacks mechanistic question, but again, it can get pretty intense. So why did your background as a mathematician factor into designing a Siddur, and how did it do it specifically with this Siddur?
Yes, so so earlier I told you why I wrote this Siddur in terms of overcoming people's obstacles. That explanation really only tells you why a Siddur should be written, but it doesn't tell you why I should write that Siddur. So why did I write the Siddur, and what does that have to do with my being a mathematician? I think being a mathematician gave me the importance of understanding something. Mathematicians are usually thought of as people who work with numbers and who add and subtract very well and multiply and divide and do square roots and all things like that. But really what mathematicians do is, go on these creative explorations of trying to figure out what is the structure of certain kinds of systems. And so I learned to ask questions. I mean, and it goes back to, as I said before, Eina Ba'ishan Lo Meid, someone who doesn't ask questions, you don't learn. I asked questions as a mathematician, and so I learned mathematics through asking questions. I don't feel that the mathematics of it contributed a great deal to my writing this Siddur, but one thing that did was that I wrote books before. I wrote math books before. I wrote one book which has 470 pages, so that was a long-term project. And long-term projects is what academics are able to do. So I could start writing, I could start working on the Siddur. I could have the, so to speak, the chutzpah or the hubris to write it, to take it upon myself to write a Siddur, even though I don't have the credentials to do so, because I know what's involved in creating a book. So that's another part of why I wrote a Siddur. Another part I mentioned in the Siddur itself, I think in the introduction, is that I always had the idea that I would write a Sefer Torah. That when I was 50 years old, I would then have enough time to sit down and write a Sefer Torah. Forget the fact that I have no skills in calligraphy or any artistic endeavor. That was somehow my understanding. But one day I was at a retreat somewhere, and I said, the Sefer Torah I should write is a Siddur, not a Torah. And many years later, that came to pass. So those are some responses. It really doesn't address the question of what the mathematics involved is, but at least that gives you some idea of where my writing Siddur comes from. But it is something that I now, as I said, I've written a book on Pirkei Avot. And many people will say, why, who are you to write about Pirkei Avot? You're not an academic scholar, although I'm a scholar in some other area, but you don't have the credentials academically. You're not a rabbi, you don't have the rabbinic credentials. Who are you to write a book on Pirkei Avot? So the answer is, I've learned a lot in my lifetime, and I have a lot that I think to share, and I'm a teacher. That's basically how I describe myself, as a teacher in wherever I am. And with the Siddur, what I learned from my meditations and from my explorations of the Siddur, I feel a need to share with others. And so that's another part of why I wrote the Siddur.
So I'm going to ask one question amidst the others. Again, anybody else, if you have a question, do the reaction function and raise your hand. The question I wanted to throw in here was, again, this is an adaptation sort of another question that was asked. Why you picked some prayers to include and some others not? And again, I'm more thinking of the Machzor. So as you may know, that in the conservative movement, the newer version of that came out about 10 years ago, let's say, their new Machzor, that one of the most meaningful prayers, which is actually a daily prayer, starts in the high holidays, starts Hazdonot v'Hashkagot Tayamakir, and it gets to Me'anu Mechayenu Mechastenu. What are we? What's our life? What's our kindness, and so on? It's a really reflective prayer, which in many traditional Siddurim is said every single morning. In the conservative Machzor, they've taken that out. I don't know why. They took that out of the Musaf on Yom Kippur. And here you've kept it. So it's an example, but why did you keep this and not that? In other words, what
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So I basically, if you're asking specifically about the Machzor, but let me first talk about the Siddur. In the Siddur, I didn't keep all of the Psalms in Psukei de Zimra. Basically, I just included those Psalms which Arminian used usually. There are some Psalms which, you have, if you look at the Psalms in general, you'll find that of the 150 Psalms in the book of Psalms, about 1/3 of them are used in the liturgy. About 1/3 of them have a line or two in the liturgy, and 1/3 are not in the liturgy at all. And you ask yourself why, and the answer is, some Psalms are better than other Psalms. they more closely match what human beings feel and need to hear about than others. Some are just don't match, and that's not just today. That means they were never put into the liturgy and over a 2,000-year period. So we use certain Psalms of Psukei de Zimra, and we didn't use some others. So I left some others out for that reason. Maybe I was a mistake. Someone once said to me, you shouldn't have, you have Psalm 146, 148, and 150, and you leave out 147 and 149. And don't you know that it says that someone who says those 5 Psalms is equivalent to having said all 150 Psalms? So my response, which I didn't give at the time because I didn't think fast enough, would be, well, okay, if you say 146, 148, 150, that's equivalent to saying 3/5 of all of the Psalms. So I left some things out just simply to keep that briefer. And, it may have been a mistake, but nevertheless. In the Machzor, I followed very closely the Machzor, the previous Machzor of the conservative movement by, it's known by the author's name. What's his name?
Harlow?
Harlow's Machzor. I followed that very closely. Things that were there, I generally kept. I didn't. I'll tell you 2 changes that I made, but generally I kept it the same. But I also added some piyutim from the Sephardic tradition, because the piyutim from the Sephardic tradition were more likely to have a call and response tone to them. That is to say, the Chazan would chant something and people would respond, call, respond, call, respond. That was usually the case in Sephardic piyutim, but not usually the case in Ashkenazic piyutim. So, but now what were the 2 changes that I made in the Machzor? One was the Avodah service. I felt the Avodah service, just that didn't resonate with people. It didn't resonate with me. The Avodah service is really an elaboration of the Torah reading on Yom Kippur. The Torah reading on Yom Kippur is a description of what the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, did at the temple when it existed. And this is an elaboration of it in great detail. And I didn't feel that people resonated with it. So I rewrote it as a meditation, would you believe, where the leader is someone who is there, visualizing the service and experiencing what the service was like, and sort of I thought that would fit people's that would resonate with people much more than the traditional Amidah service. The second major change that I made in the Machzor was was the martyrology service. So I made a different martyrology. So the martyrology service sort of remembers the martyrs of ages ago, but
Ezkara, right?
Ezkara, yeah,
right.
But only talks about the martyrs of ages ago, and it doesn't speak at all about the heroes. And the theme that we follow nowadays in observance of the Holocaust is the martyrs and the heroes, because there were many heroes. So I wrote a different prayer, and I didn't see it as being part of the Musaf service, because the Ela Eskara, the refrain is Chatanu Tzureinu Slach Lanu Yotzreinu, that we were martyred because of our sins, forgive us. And the idea that we have been martyred before our sins, I personally find objectionable. That people have found lots of reasons to martyr us, which have nothing to do with our sins, unfortunately. And so I didn't think that it should be like that. So I wrote a martyrology which is different, as Harlow did in his, but he keeps it in the same place. What I did is I put it as part of the Yizkor service, and I made it there so it should be a history lesson for all the people who stay for the Yizkor service. And I think that's very important, because to have it at the end of Musaf, where everybody's gone, is not a good place for it. That it's much better placed at the Yizkor service, as part of the Yizkor service, where we remember our martyrs from ages ago and our martyrs from recently, as well as our heroes from recently. So those are the two major changes that I made. But otherwise, I stayed pretty close to Harlow. I didn't have any. There's a few phrases here and there that I had some objections to, so I put those in brackets so that people can, and with a comment on the side in the commentary column saying, look, you may not agree with this phrase, in which case, leave it out. It's okay.
Right. So we have a question from David Caputo. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes.
Yes. You had mentioned in Psalm 23 the phrase "for his name's sake." You said was not easy to understand or something. But I just thought I'd give something that I thought what it meant, because the whole sentence says, "The Lord leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake," or in right paths. So that made me think of like the Ten Commandments, where he says, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain." And then also in Leviticus chapter 19, he says, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy."
Yes.
So it seems like he wants, for his reputation and his namesake, he wants it to remain holy and glorified instead of being tarnished. So he leads us in those paths of righteousness so that we can stay on the right path and be a good witness, like he calls us to be good witnesses on earth. So,
right. That's a very nice explanation. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a very nice explanation. I wanted to go back to that reminds me. Let me. No, I won't. Too much technology. Yes. Let's see if you have any more questions. That
Other questions. We're almost winding down. We have probably another 10 minutes or so. So please ask more questions. I can go on. If this was a Tikkun Leil Shavuot, we could go until the.
Yes. Let me just mention. I forgot to say in response to the question, John's question that you mentioned before. One of the questions that someone wrote down was whether I had trouble praying with other prayer books after writing my own prayer book. So the answer is yes, because when I read another prayer book, I find it hard to stay in praying mode. I move to editorial mode and comparing what they say with what I say. So that makes it hard for me to use other people's prayer books. That's a very unfortunate thing, but I'm human. But in response to what John said, what John asked, I found it very difficult to use my own prayer book as well for the first few years, because whenever I would be reading it, I would be reading it as a prayer, as someone who is praying, and as an editor, and I couldn't turn that off. It took me a few years before I could turn that off. So in some ways, writing a prayer book is deleterious to praying. I found it very funny at the time, but I was helpless against that. Okay, Erwin.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think, because if you get very steeped in the minutia of it, and clearly the meaning, the overall meaning, and what's very, very clear from your motivation is the spirituality. And so those are great motivations. And again, it probably is difficult to then go back to the mantra aspect of prayer, where it's every day sometimes, and sometimes not as significant on the Tuesday as it is on a Wednesday.
Yes.
This is an interesting Professor Green. I just lost his first name. Who used to be at the in Philadelphia, right?
Art Green.
Art Green. Thank you. And one of his things that he had many different theses that he was talking about, but in the Orthodox sense of having to do the prayers 3 times a day all the time, what's the notion of this repetitiveness and where could you fit in here and there the spirituality? You can't do that time and time again. And so he actually falls back on the notion of at least some of it becomes mantra, but it at least gives you you never know when you're going to break out from mantra into spirituality, especially if you allow yourself those parameters.
Yes.
But I can understand that if you're steeped in writing and editing all the spirituality and guideposts and commentaries, it may be hard sometimes to go back to just a mundane mantra.
Yes. Yeah. So yes, I mean, I can't say for sure, but I would guess that almost nobody prays with kavana all the time. It's not so easy to do, to pray with intention, to be there completely. That's hard for us to do. We're human, and we're distracted in many ways by many things. And if you do pray regularly, then from time to time you will have insights, and from time to time you will be there fully, and from time to time you will be there partially. And you do what you can. But as I say, in the prayer at the end of the Amida that I read before, that's something that is very meaningful to me. And each time I read it, I'm reminded that it is not. It's not that God leaves us; it's that we leave God, and that we can, if we want to, find God very easily in some sense. Not. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I agree. I made a point one time in having this discussion by saying to someone, what would it be? Can you imagine working at the Grand Canyon? You're one of these U.S. Park people that works in the Grand Canyon. And, anybody who's been to the Grand Canyon, you see it and it's just amazing. Awe. You have, you're awestruck.
Yes.
But you work there every day. And you walk by and you look at it's the Grand Canyon every day. And we think of that, I think of that, and I said, that's a shame. That's not a mundane thing. That's a shame that even on a daily basis, that person walks by and nonetheless doesn't say, "Oh, wow. My God, look at this! Wow,
yes. Wow, yes." Well, but we all have things in our lives which we can say "wow" at, and we don't. That's unfortunate, but that's that's how it is. We often lose sight of the big picture.
Right. I think by the way,
prayer helps us brings us close to the big picture. It's very funny, actually, that you mentioned that, because one person who bought a copy of my weekday prayer book in the smaller version of it, physically smaller version of it, told me that he was a guide down the Colorado River. So, and he wanted to have this prayer book with him as he went down the Colorado River. So he took people on rides down the Colorado River. So that reminded me of it. So I wanted to tell you, no, you didn't ask, come back to Psalm 23. So I want to tell you a story. Maybe that's a good way to close. I don't know. About 5 years ago, I think it was, I fainted we were having a meal at my daughter's house, and I fainted right sitting there at the table, and they didn't know what to do. So I got schlepped off to the hospital. By the time I got to the hospital, I was okay. And I stayed there for a few days. They made sure I was okay. But when I got to the hospital, I was on a gurney, and a doctor walks up to my foot of my gurney, and he says to me, he looks at my name, and he says, "Please tell me, which do you like better, Psalm 23 or Psalm 27?" So that's a very interesting thing for a doctor to say. So I knew that obviously for some reason or other, he decided I was somebody, and went on and Googled me and found that I had done a meditation tape on Psalm 23 and Psalm 27. So I told him that it's like asking me which of my children do I like better, do I love more? It's, you know, I love this one, I love that one. So then he accepted that answer, and then he continued. He said, "What does it mean in Psalm 23 where it says, 'You set a table for me in the face of my enemies'?" So he evidently didn't know the context of Psalm 23, which is that David is on the run. King David, later to King David, now he's just ordinary David. He's on the run from King Saul, who wants to kill him because Saul has become paranoid about David. And David is on the run. He's surrounded by Saul's men. And he and his band of men sit and have a meal together. And he says, "You prepare me a meal in the middle of my enemies." So it's a statement of trust in God, that God will take care of him, even though, you know, the king and all of his men are out to get him. And so I said to the doctor, you know, I feel the same. I feel the same way here. Here I have come to the emergency room of the hospital. I have no idea what's going to happen. I have no idea what you're going to do to me, but I have the faith that things will turn out well. And interestingly enough, after I left the hospital, I sent him a copy of the tape, and we got together, started getting together pretty regularly for lunch. So it was a very curious end of the story. But I wanted to say that something about Psalm 23, which you might disturb you, and that is that the last line of Psalm 23 is, "I shall live in the house of the Lord for all of my days." That's not how it's translated in the King James Version. The King James Version makes it sound like it's in life to come as well, which is the reason why both in Christianity and in Judaism, I don't know when it took place in Judaism, read it at funerals, because somehow the idea is that you're going to be living in the house of God. For David, living in the house of God was not life after death, but this life. To live in the house of God is something that each of us can choose to do. And that was part of the prayer that I read before. I read the last line in the prayer that I read for the end of the Amida. The last line, on the last part of it, I made 3 quotes. One was the Shiviti quote. The next quote was, "V'shavti b'veit Adonai l'orech yamim." May we choose to live in your house all the days of our lives. And that's what David had in mind, that God will protect him during his life. And we, each of us, again, can choose to decide to live in God's house. If you go to that page on which Psalm 23 is in the Siddur or in the Machzor, you'll see a meditation on what that might mean. So I thank you all for being here. If you have any other questions, you can always get in touch with me. My email address, I think, is in the Siddur and in the Machzor. I will shortly have a new website which is joerosenstein.com, where you can get any of the books we talked about, or the Pirkei Avot book after a month or so. So it's joerosenstein.com, and you can get in touch with me through that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yasher Koach.
Baruch
So
Tzia.
much, Joe.
Okay. Very
Yasher
good.
Koach.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Thank you.
Okay. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
night.
Thanks to for this.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for participating. And we hope to do this again about Pirkei Avot, and this is a great relationship. Anyway, be well. Thank you so much for all your contributions.
Good night.
Everybody. Good night. Well,
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.